Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This one is episode 91, and I'm joined by a really great and excellent guest that I'm very excited to bring to you. That is Brian Saady. And Brian Saady is a freelance journalist and author of 4 books, including a 3-book series entitled Rackets, which discusses the legalization of drugs, gambling, and prostitution, respectively. His work has appeared in outlets such as The American Conservative, Antiwar.com, Counterpunch, ActivistPost, and the Foundation for Economic Education. And additionally, he is the host of an excellent podcast entitled Rackets. So how are you doing, Brian?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. I'm super excited here. Why don't you first tell me a little bit about your book series? I think you're the author of 4 books, correct?
Yeah. You're talking about the series. It's called Rackets, as you mentioned. It primarily talks about the legalization of drugs and gambling and the decriminalization of prostitution. The series is called Rackets. You mentioned I have a podcast called Rackets. It's basically my focus is pretty wide as far as political issues. So with that book series, I was trying to make the argument in favor of legalization and decriminalization. But in the process, I was also trying to expose a lot of other rackets. In other words, I go into the many definitions of the word. So that's crony capitalism, corrupt politicians, wasteful, bureaucracy, all kinds of, like I say, all types of different rackets. I was trying to make the argument in that favor and also just expose other issues that I think that people should know about as well.
Okay, excellent. And for the viewers here, I have your website on screen here so they can see the 3 books that we're talking about currently. But can I ask you, what got you into this problem? I know before the show we were talking about you're currently living in Orlando. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Just what motivated me to write the series?
Yeah.
It goes back to in the earliest days of the Obama administration. So, there was a lot of this optimism for change. I mean, that was his slogan, for change. And it was before, if I remember, I think it was actually before he actually went into office. It was in that interim period, and he was doing a national tour. And there was a young college student who asked him, hey, what do you think about the idea, of legalizing drugs, gambling, and prostitution? And the audience just roared with laughter, and he was kind of making the point, well, I study criminology, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this would make sense, as far as a policy. So I didn't do it immediately. I didn't start immediately after that, and I'd wanted to write. I had a lot of different, topics on my mind, but it seemed like a challenge, but it also was really the topics that I'd also spoken about those same topics for quite a while. I'm like, no, these are really important topics, and there's just too much stigma behind it. But people really should know that, like I say, that there's a lot more to these topics than meets the eye. So that was really the motivation to write that series.
Yeah, right. And I think for a lot of people, they really recoil when you mention. I think it's becoming a little more acceptable now.
Yeah.
But they really do recoil. And I remember when I was going through college and I had heard of these ideas from the libertarian side of things, I really recoiled too. And that was one of my last sticking points, really, was, well, we can't just legalize all drugs, So have you encountered that a lot?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And to me, it's kind of funny, just as far as even wording. If you say to somebody, hey, I'm for ending the war on drugs, a lot of people, and it wasn't that way, say 5-10 years ago, they'll say, yeah, I agree with you. But then if you say, hey, I'd like to legalize or decriminalize heroin, and people will immediately push back and go, what? Well, what do you think the war on drugs is? If you look at the polling on those numbers, I'm going off memory, but if I remember, it's around 10% for what Americans think when it comes to, say, heroin or cocaine or methamphetamine, the really dangerous drugs. When you start talking legalization or decriminalization, only about 10% of Americans support that. Now, if you talk about marijuana, the numbers are right around 60%. and we've seen it, state by state, we start to see the progress, that less people are getting arrested. There's more positives than negatives that go along with legalization. So there's much less stigma attached to that. But yeah, you mentioned the books. I did try to give people a pretty good dose of the actual history on these types of issues. Heroin used to be legal to go into a pharmacy and buy. If you look at the stats, and again, you can't really get 100% reliable statistics on this stuff. But if you look at addiction and usage rate statistics, before this was criminalized, for almost, for decades and really a century, usage rates were right about the same. So prohibition really didn't have much impact at all on the actual usage rates. And in fact, the last, say, 10 years or so, it's really spiked, and even higher than before, prohibition went into effect.
Right. And I've done some work on this as well, but you also have the added negatives of, I know fentanyl is the big thing that everyone is talking about, and it's really killing a lot of people. And so one of the benefits that we've always struck on is, yeah, you could walk into a drugstore and buy heroin, but at least you knew what you were getting.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're bringing up, it's that more people are dying from the heroin now. That's why it's getting the headlines. And that has a lot to do with this bootleg fentanyl that the drug cartels are mixing in there, and drug dealers are mixing. Well, not so much the cartels, they'll produce it, but a lot of the street level dealers are mixing it in to boost the strength of their drug. And exactly like you say, somebody's buying this drug off the street, they don't know the strength, and there's a good chance that they could die. Not to say that they couldn't die even from the pure stuff, but the risks are increased in this completely, in this total black market.
And it always blows my mind too, and I brought this up on the show as well, that didn't we learn our lesson with prohibition? It just blows my mind. And you see the parallel here with the fentanyl, as well as in prohibition times we had bootleggers making moonshine, and some of it had some really detrimental effects, and some of it was very toxic, and a lot of people also died. So yeah, there's just so many ways to come about this. But have you come across, and this is something you'll always stumble on, is the racist origins of these prohibiting substances, but these laws as well. So have you come across that at all in your work?
Oh yeah, I did a decent amount of writing on that. That had a lot to do with the motivation. And it, nowadays, racist talk, in many ways, it's in sort of coded language when it comes to politics. But in 1910 and 1920, you didn't need to code the language. It was very direct. And I don't want to use the exact words and all this type of stuff, but basically, there were, many lurid stories to say that, a black man could have superhuman strength if he was using cocaine. It would force him to go rape white women. And I mean, there were millions of these different stories that it swept up a lot of the American imagination, and basically absolutely no truth to any of this stuff. But again, 100 years ago, that's what fly, and right. And it absolutely had a lot to do with those first laws. And the first laws were actually more aimed at Asian Americans. That's where a lot of those opium dens were, out there on the West Coast. And again, if you go back and you read a lot of these original articles and some of the legislation, the process for the bills, it was very direct. There was a major racial component behind the motivation behind these laws. And again, these laws still exist. And I mean, you don't have to be a criminologist to notice that there is a major disparity in how these laws are enforced. And I mean, there still is a racial component to drug laws.
And in some ways too, I keep alluding to prohibition, but it's the one I know the most about, alcohol prohibition, that is. But
yeah, there's a direct comparison. Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
The direct parallels, but it also has ripple effects. When it came to the anti-saloon league, or the, total T prohibition, absolute, no alcohol, it had a very detrimental effect with a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, and it was pushed by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants more so against Germans and Catholics, people who would come to the United States and who would go to the saloons, and for them it was a place to network and to get to know the language and to have employment opportunities. So it really is that ripple effect.
And that was another one where, as far as the prohibition laws with alcohol, again, that anti-immigrant language, it was quite direct. Again, it wasn't encoded bigotry. It was very direct. Companies like Anheuser-Busch, some groups actually, accused them of treason, that they were going to send this money to help fight in the war. I mean, it was, again, there's an ugly history behind a lot of these prohibition laws.
And I think that, nowadays we might chuckle a little bit at anti-German sentiment. I think it's not something that we would think about, but there are lots of targeted groups as well. But Brian, I'm not too familiar with the history of gambling and prostitution that I'm sure you would go into, but is there a lot of the same sentiment in those two areas?
As far as race, not so much. Now with prostitution, you'll definitely see some of that. Your major, most states didn't have prostitution laws. That was really a function of the early 20th century, right around World War I. And there were a few different factors. Eugenics was actually one of the motivating factors. You had Rockefeller family that really pushed a lot of that. A lot of the narrative was that a prostitute was too, quote unquote, feeble-minded to act for themselves. You had to form these laws, but a lot of it had to do with basic what they called a social hygiene movement as well. It was to try to really, it was tied into World War I in many ways, that we had to outlaw this because this was a national security issue. To stop the spread of disease, we had to ban this activity in order to win the war. There were a lot of other factors. There was really a lot of the progressive movement as well was actually behind a lot of these laws. But it went from basically no state prostitution laws to almost every state within around this 5 to 10 year period from around 1910 to 1920. So as far as gambling, not as much. The Italian American mafia obviously had a lot of impact there as far as controlling those markets. Outlawing it, I guess you could say so, and there was definitely that angle to it. But I wouldn't say nowhere near the level as far as, like, say, the drug laws and the prostitution laws.
Well, what was the impetus behind gambling laws? And I guess you could address prostitution too. You mentioned World War I, but what about gambling?
Well, gambling laws have really moved in a lot of waves. I mean, we're seeing a wave right now where all of a sudden sports gambling is becoming a state-by-state issue. It has to do with a recent Supreme Court case. But I mean, the founding forefathers, most of those guys gambled. And there's also many types of gambling. So certain forms of gambling will be outlawed, and it kind of bounces back and forth. But really, the main form of gambling that you saw in our earliest days were lotteries. So in a lot of times these were, and again, this was considered a way to raise tax revenue for the government in a voluntary fashion. So really, most of the founding forefathers were big proponents of it. Many of the earliest universities were funded this way. Roads, all these kind of public works projects were funded through lotteries. So there were different waves. You started to see right around the 1830s or so. Then you see this very strong anti-gambling sentiment. It has a lot to do with, say, like Mississippi riverboat gamblers. And basically the word gambler became synonymous with like a scammer, a grifter. These were really completely unregulated businesses, just sort of little shanty towns where you'd have some sort of, card game inside there, no real regulation or anything like that. So it was, just again, a haven for ripoffs and all kinds of things like that. There were also, you started to see, we're talking about lotteries, because eventually at one point lotteries were banned in every state except for one. And it goes back to a lot of these scams. A lot of lotteries you would mail in and you would send it across state lines to send in your lottery ticket. But again, a lot of times it was just all a scam to begin with. So that, that created a lot of the sentiment to ban lotteries. Anybody who's ever watched any old gangster movie, they probably heard of terms like numbers. And what that was, those were basically black market or bootleg lotteries. So where, different gambling syndicates, they would form their own lotteries. You would say, base it off of the last three numbers on the stock market or a baseball score. And that's people, it's just the same thing as those lottery balls that are bouncing up, here in our current one, just that was all done underground. And we kind of talked about the negatives of prohibition. Well, guess what? This was a big time racket, millions of dollars, and gangsters were fighting over this money to control that black market. But again, that wave eventually started. We go through the different waves with criminalization. So around the 1970s, you start to see more states legalizing state lotteries again. And now, basically every state has one. It creates billions of dollars. It's a voluntary tax on the population. I think that more positive comes out of that than the negative. And don't get me wrong, there's negatives with gambling and with lotteries. But again, I firmly believe that legalization and regulation far outweighs the negatives. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to touch on you because you had a good podcast episode on that Supreme Court case, and I also did an episode on that case. And yeah. I'll do the screen share here, just so we can see the episode that I did. Do you recall which episode number that was from your podcast? I'll put the link in the show notes page.
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay, but I will put that link in the show notes page here. But I think in that episode you really kind of highlighted the history of gambling in New Jersey, and you were pretty clear to say that the Supreme Court ruling does not legalize gambling; it just allows the states to legalize it if they are. I'm not recalling the official holding of the case. I did bring it up here.
It was it originally was I can't think of his name now. It was Christie v. U.S. Now it's Murphy. I'm sorry, versus NCAA et al. Because it's a lawsuit against the college athletics, the NCAA, NBA, NFL, NHL, and Major League Baseball. So they were fighting to uphold a law called PASPA that was passed back in 1992, which basically grandfathered in the 4 states at that time that had forms of gambling. That was Nevada. You also had Oregon, Delaware, and Montana. Although Oregon, Delaware, and Montana basically had absolutely nothing going. In fact, Montana has extremely limited form of sports gambling, and at that time, Delaware and Oregon were completely inactive. They actually had what they called a sports lottery. Not to get too in the weeds, if you're not a sports gambler, it's basically like 2 or 3 game parlay bets. So what that law did was it grandfathered those states in, and no other state could then pass legalized gambling within their boundaries. So what happened was, I think it was around 2013, if I'm remembering right, the state of New Jersey decided to challenge that. And they put a voter referendum on the ballot. And I think it was something like around 60% of the voters in their state said, yes, we want to offer legalized sports betting within our state. And this challenge has been going back and forth for years. And in fact, the state of New Jersey had to refile and redress it. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I can't go into all those details. But long story short, it was a 10th Amendment challenge. And a few months ago, that was probably like 4 or 5 months ago, the U.S. Supreme Court did decide to rule in the state of New Jersey's favor. And now what that's done, that's opened the door for a few other states. Delaware has passed laws to legalize sports gambling. Mississippi has, and quite a few other states are looking at it.
Yeah, that was a really good summary of the facts. I have the SCOTUS blog opinion up here, and just to rehash the holding of the case, it was provisions of the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act that prohibit state authorization and licensing of sports gambling schemes violate the Constitution's anti-commandeering rule, and no other PASPA provisions are severable from the provisions at issue. So just for the audience's sake, just stating that because this one clause violates the Constitution, everything violates the Constitution, and we can't sever that out. We can't sever that portion out and keep the rest of the bill. I thought it was so interesting, Brian, just in an issue that you never really see come up in front of the Supreme Court. I think between 1913 and the 1990s, there was no federal law was found to be in violation of the 10th Amendment.
Wow.
And since then, the Supreme Court has been giving a bit more teeth to the 10th Amendment. I just thought it was great that you went over that case, and I'll refer to the listeners to that episode because it was a good one.
Let me throw one thing at you too, because when the bill was in the process of drafting, it had to be approved, and of course I'm forgetting the Senate committee right now, which was at the time headed by Joe Biden. And the DOJ sent, all types of warnings that, hey, we think there's a lot of constitutional issues with this law. But again, they obviously went forward with it. And it goes back to kind of what we were talking about originally, that, there's a lot of stigma with these types of issues, drugs, gambling, any sort of controversial issue like that. So it basically got a rubber stamp, no matter what the constitutional issues were behind it, where you basically gave the state of Nevada, a monopoly on sports gambling. And again, it went through in part because there's such a stigma behind it. And in fact, really one of the authors of the bill openly even stated that, hey, I understand that this bill isn't really going to be effective in any way. It's not really going to root out the actual demand for sports gambling, but we're going to do it anyway. And again, I'm paraphrasing that, but that was essentially what he said.
Right. Yeah. And I can understand because these are things that I didn't really know until I started law school. But it's kind of civics, how the constitutional process works is that the Congress can pass a bill and sign it into law, even though it might violate the Constitution. You just have to have the court system look at it then. And there's certain things in order to challenge you have to, a litigant has to have a personal damage. The case has to be ripe for adjudication. The mnemonic is ramps, but I'm not remembering every step right now. I think I had to know this for the bar exam, but
no, that's interesting. Yeah, that is very interesting.
I think ripeness, you have to show like personal damage, like taxpayers, you have to have standing to sue. So taxpayers cannot sue just because they pay taxes. You actually have to have personal damages that you're suffering, and there's a few other ones.
The person directly, you're saying, right? It can't be just across the board lawsuit. It has to be some. So, for example, say a casino owner in New Jersey who could show that he has actual damages because he's losing that revenue. Am I understanding that right or no?
Yeah. So, excuse me here. I'm trying to. Yeah. So the casino owner does have to show personal damage, that his business is personally affected by this law. You can't just be a citizen that pays taxes, and you don't like what the government is doing, so you file a lawsuit.
Right,
so
that makes sense.
Mootness, standing. Like I said, the mnemonic is ramps to remember everything, and I'm not remembering some of the letters, but I didn't think we'd be talking about this.
I'll be quizzing you after the show, so don't worry about it.
Right, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer either, so yeah, so why don't we get into some of the criminal justice issues that you talk about as well, because I thought some of the articles that you had, and I'll be showing them on the screen as well. Why don't we start with one of your articles from the American Conservative talking about when forensic evidence goes bad.
Okay.
And how did you find out about this issue, if you recall?
Oh, I actually touched upon it briefly in my first book, the Drug War book. Basically, and what I've tried to make a point is that the criminal justice system leans heavily in favor of the prosecution. Um, and like I said, I touched upon it briefly in that article. Um, if anybody's familiar with the name Frederick Whitehurst, and again, he's not a household name, but he should be. The guy's a really heroic, brave person. He was a bomb residue expert, and he worked at the FBI. That started back in the mid 90s. And he basically immediately noticed that, wow, there's a whole lot of lawyers here working in this crime. I'm sorry, he started working the crime lab back in the mid 90s. And pretty much everybody in the crime lab, none of them actually had science degrees. They were lawyers or English degrees. That really none of the people there were qualified to be doing scientific studies, especially for something as important as forensic evidence. He noticed that the labs were contaminated. It was ruining the validity of the evidence. But most of all, he noticed that a lot of the people who were testifying in court, who claimed to be experts in fields of forensic science, were not actually experts. And again, time after time, whenever evidence is presented, if it's tainted evidence, I've noticed, and pretty much anybody who's looks into criminal justice, you'll see that the errors always err in favor of the prosecution. So really, one of the points I try to get across is that a crime lab should be 100% independent. There should be no bias at all. And I'm not saying that every person who works in this field is corrupt. I'm not saying that in any way. But really what I wanted to, point out is that there's sort of an institutional bias. There's one example, I'm trying to remember her name, Annie Dukin. She worked in the crime lab in Massachusetts. And something like over 20,000 cases were invalidated because she basically, for one thing, she wasn't even really doing the work. And at the end of the day, she was essentially working for the prosecution. She knew it. Say a public defender wanted to walk in and ask her questions about the evidence, she would ask if it was even permissible to speak to that person. But this person, the point being is that there was an institutional pressure to get these results, make sure that it's in favor of the prosecution. I point to that example, but there are a lot of other crime lab scandals that are somewhat similar. And again, that's one factor. There are a lot of people who, again, we mentioned the FBI. I'm sorry. Let's kind of go back a bit because I wanted to. A reason why I bring up the FBI example is that goes back to the 90s. Frederick Whitehurst, back in I think it was 98, he eventually got over $1 million settlement to go away from the FBI. They wanted him to go away. Once in an interview, I remember him saying, the cardinal rule of the FBI is don't embarrass the FBI. But long story short, he got this, over $1 million settlement, and he started, reviewing even more cases and blowing the whistle on all types of cases. And, high profile cases in which evidence was tainted. So, in short, basically, his work has prompted a whole lot of follow-up and a whole lot of fact-checking. And roughly 3 years ago, there was a study done by the FBI, the DOJ, the Innocence Project. Of course, I'm forgetting which other group. But they went in and they went back and they reviewed FBI cases in which they were using hair analysis. For anybody, if you've ever watched, say, a CSI show or something like that, that's considered definitive evidence. Well, the truth is that there's a lot of scientific proof to show that this is kind of junk science. There's some that say that. There's also a lot of people who are really unqualified to be testifying as experts. And again, to try to do it concisely, This report from roughly 3 years ago, they went back and they reviewed about 500 cases, and they found that 90% of the cases, their experts gave faulty evidence. Like I said, 90% of the cases. In some of these cases, people were executed. And in the 35 cases where somebody was executed, 33 of those included false evidence from a hair analysis expert. There's other forms of forensic science, and again, I don't want somebody to think that I'm trying to invalidate the whole form of forensic science. Not in any way. I mean, that is the current standard, and it's only going to get better with more and more time and more scientific research, and the more people who learn this type of stuff. But I just want to caution people that there are a lot of people going and serving time in prison for sometimes evidence that isn't accurate. There's a guy in Texas right now where they're going through an evidentiary hearing. He was convicted of murder over 30 years ago. He was a high school principal. He left town, I think it was for a convention or something, and his wife was murdered back at home. There was a lot of physical evidence to suggest that he wasn't the murderer. The fact that there was a cigarette butt at the scene, and the guy, he didn't smoke, his wife didn't smoke. The police said that was left by one of their investigators. He had all kinds of character witnesses. Basically, every bit of evidence in that trial suggested that he was not guilty, other than the testimony from a bloodstain pattern expert. And that's another one of those fields in which you really have to have a certain level of expertise, because even the top experts can disagree on some of the findings. But there are a lot of people who are testifying in court who've taken a 40-hour class and they're considered certified, when that's the type of field that 40 hours, most people would tell you that is not enough to be considered an expert. And you really shouldn't be testifying, like I said, murder cases as an expert in that scenario. And again, this guy's he's been serving, his name's Joe Bryan. He's been serving over 30 years for a murder, when that, like I said, the testimony from a bloodstain was the primary form of evidence that put him away. And like I said, he is fighting this in court. There are a lot of experts who've reviewed the bloodstain spatter and in that case, and did not come to the same conclusions. In other words, they think that, he should get a new trial and most likely should be found not guilty.
And it's so interesting that you bring this up too, Brian, because the most interesting part that I found about your article was the idea of what the role the media plays, especially with these dramatized television shows like NCIS.
Right. I'm a big fan of Dexter. I didn't watch the show. I literally just started binge watching it on Netflix. Love the show, but again, it is a fictional show. But like you're saying, exactly. Sometimes some people, especially a lot of jury members, these shows have sort of captured their imagination, and that sort of becomes the standard in a lot of people's eyes. And there's no questioning this evidence in any way for some people. So yeah, I would fully agree.
And just for me to riff off that too for a second, in order to be considered an expert in terms of expert testimony in court, you have usually the standard is what's called the Daubert standard. And the Daubert standard has been adopted on the federal level for federal courts, but it's also been adopted by a lot of different states. And in order to qualify as an expert in a case, the elements that you have to meet or the elements the court considers is whether the theory or technique in question can be and has been tested. 2, whether it has been subjected to peer review and publication. 3, its known or potential error rate. 4, the existence and maintenance of standards controlling its operation. And 5, whether it has attracted widespread acceptance within a relevant scientific community. So you could really see, how you could squeeze in an expert there.
And absolutely. That seems like there's a very wide latitude to that.
Right.
There's a lot of subjectivity to that.
But that's also a function of the rules of evidence in general, is that they tell you in school that the rules of evidence have a liberal thrust. So there's a lean already towards admitting evidence. But
Mhm.
you're right, exactly right, is that while normally we go through the process of jury trials where you're tried by your peers, well, if your peers are watching NCIS, and just because the evidence is admitted doesn't mean that it's reliable, you're supposed to rely on the jury, with their common sense to determine how reliable this evidence is. And so I thought it was so interesting that you brought up the role of television shows like that.
And now that you just mentioned the fact of juries, most cases don't go to trial. Over 90% of cases end up in a plea deal. So,
Right.
and not everybody, in fact, the majority of people really don't have the resources to adequately fight their case in court.
Exactly. And if you one thing I've mentioned too is if you're facing a trial, well, one of my big things is that people in the justice system are dealing with criminals. Well, not criminals per se. They are dealing with criminals, but
Sure.
my general point is that people in the justice system, maybe prosecutors and judges, usually have never faced charges before themselves. They've
That's a
never
good
been to
point.
jail. They've never been to prison. And I just find it interesting because one of my lawyer friends was saying he's been to jail, and he says that every prosecutor and every judge should spend a few days in jail.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is kind of funny how you see all these people once they get into the system, then they want to reform it.
Right.
And I don't want to point fingers because there are a lot of people who are doing good work, but you will notice that trend. There are a whole lot of people who are they love that tough on crime mantra, but then suddenly their taxes didn't come out right, or their a politician's campaign finances didn't add up right. They have to go serve 6 months in a federal prison, and suddenly they come back and they're all for prison reform.
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
I mean, again, and I'm not going to point at specific individuals because I do believe that I believe in also changing your opinion when you have a different set of information. But yeah, it's funny how that tune can change once you actually go in there and experience that. It's Another point I'm always trying to make is that, and most people know this, is that for most people, prison tends to be a pretty counterproductive use of their time. It's not really very rehabilitative. It tends to push people back into prison.
Right. And here's a good transition point to your next article, throwing children away the school to prison pipeline. And sending children to jail only makes their situation worse. It doesn't reform them, and in many cases, it leads to a life of crime. And you can see on the screen here is uh, that article again in the American Conservative. Brian, you just want to walk us through the point of the article, especially with school resource officers and the rising prevalence of school resource officers.
Okay. You started to see, school resource officers. In other words, we can use that term, but basically police officers who are on campus for schools. That's what that is. You started to see a major rise in the number of these school police officers in the mid to late 90s. It was all part of a zero tolerance movement, and I actually try to give an analogy in the article, which again, actually speaking of ex-prosecutors, Paul Butler. I don't know if anybody knows his name. He's big time media personality now, but he's an ex-prosecutor, and he's a big proponent of reforming the criminal justice system. But one of the things he pointed out, I read one of his books. He gave a really interesting stat, and he pointed out that in New York City, the most arrests occur on Wednesdays. And it has nothing to do with the amount of crime that takes place. It's not that, suddenly people are drinking and going crazy or whatever on Wednesdays. It's that that is the day of the week when the most police officers are on duty. So the point that I'm trying to get to is that the more police you tend to put on a school campus, the more crimes they're going to write up. Now, what I'd like to point out is that it's not that there's this sudden rise in violent crimes on school campuses. But what has happened is now in the United States, roughly 30% of schools have a school resource officer on campus. And what's happened is a lot of the type of conduct. Again, and I'm not excusing bad behavior by kids. I'm not some total bleeding heart liberal. When I understand as a teacher, if a kid is acting out and talking back, or, shooting spitballs, or kids are horseplaying or whatever, I understand these types of things. They need to be disciplined, and these types of things had always been disciplined throughout the school system. But what now that we're having more and more, school resource, more and more schools have police officers on campus. Typical, dumb, immature behavior by kids is now being punished um, with criminal penalties. There's a term called the school to prison pipeline. I first heard about it, I think it was back in 2012. It had to do with a case by the DOJ when they were, pointing to really one of the most severe examples. It was in Meridian, Mississippi. But basically, I mean, there are so many of these stories that it will absolutely break your heart. I mean, I remember reading one story about a fifth grader who kicked a trash can, and he was arrested for disorderly conduct. And one of the things I'm trying to point out, there's been this rise in the number of arrests on school campuses, and it's really sort of a manufacturing of crime. It's not, it's not from more guns or knives on campuses. It's from, again, a lot of this has to do with just basically, kids acting out bad behavior that has been criminalized instead of, being suspended or sent to detention or in school detention, etc. A lot of this type of behavior is being criminalized. There have been kids that go to jail or have been arrested for, like I say, shooting spitballs, yelling in the hallways, like I said, kicking a trash can, even stuff such as even skipping class, truancy. I don't think most people think of that as a criminal activity. I mean, if you've ever watched the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, nobody would think of that as you're watching a teenager committing criminal activity. But in some places, and again, this is a very localized issue. I don't want somebody to think that this is something that happens in every school, in every state, in every city. Um, but a lot of this, again, it just has to do with basically more police officers that you have on campus. You tend to see a major rise in the number of arrests. And again, since it is a localized issue, you have to look at study to study. I cited one by a University of Tennessee professor, and he found that the presence of school resource officers, it pushed disorderly conducts up by like 500%. I've seen some really nightmare ones in certain states where it was something like 10-20% or 10 or 20 times as much disorderly conduct arrests. In other words, that's when we talked about subjectivity with essentially disorderly conduct. It's kind of like an end all be all as far as as far as just arresting kids in many cases for just acting out. And one of the things I do try to point out in the study is that a lot of this, again, when we talked about the racial aspect with the drug war and the criminal justice system, we're seeing a lot of that on school campuses. You tend to have more school resource officers, I can't even pronounce the word, police officers on campus in areas where there's a disproportionately high number of Black or Latino kids. And the Black or Latino kids tend to get arrested higher for these kind of disorderly conduct offenses. I saw one study, if I remember, it was in the state of Delaware, where Black females who got into a fight were arrested for disorderly conduct at a higher rate than white males getting into fights. And the white males cumulatively had gotten in more fights than the Black females, but the Black females were the ones who were being arrested for disorderly conduct at higher rates. I mean, there's not just the arrest aspect. There's also the aspect of police brutality. Every now and again, you'll see some of these videos, and it's just really horrific stuff. I mentioned one of them. I'm assuming you've seen it. I think most people have seen it. This was all over the news, where one of the police officers, he went in, Young girl, again, she was acting badly. She had the cell phone. The teacher told her to put it away. She refused to put it away. So the teacher says, you have to go, you have to leave the office, go to the principal's office or whatever. And she refused to leave. So, the teacher called in the police officer. And again, this girl couldn't have been over 90 pounds. Instead of just kind of, grabbing her by the hand and taking her out of her desk, he basically picked the girl up while she's in the desk and slammed her on her head and just dragged her out of there. I mean, it was vicious. And the point I want to make, there's 2 points just within that one story. That police officer, he didn't get in any kind of legal trouble, but there was a girl in the class who filmed it on her cell phone. And while it's going on, she kind of had a very natural human reaction. She said, I don't remember exactly what she said, something along like, hey, somebody stop this, just a normal human reaction. Well, that girl was arrested for disorderly conduct. That police officer, he did lose his job, but again, he didn't face any kind of legal consequences for slamming a small child on her head on a concrete floor. So again, I don't want to construe this as that this is happening in every school, but this is a problem. And with a lot of the school shootings, we're starting to see more and more schools adding school resource officers. And I just kind of wanted people to understand what you're getting yourselves into with this issue. I quoted, or I don't think I quoted him, but I mentioned a certain juvenile judge. He's in the state of Georgia. He's a guy who'd seen how this process works, how, a lot of these kids are just getting funneled into his court system there for relatively minor stuff. And he'd seen just how counterproductive this system is. And long story short, he started to kind of coordinate an effort, with the school board to where they started to address, okay, only serious offenses are going to get sent into my courtroom, relative, minor stuff like, again, arguments and just typical bad behavior from kids that needs to get punished within the school system. We're not going to send serious offenses into the court system. And guess what? It had really good results. Off the top of my head, I can't remember any of the statistics, but
I got it right here, actually. Sorry to cut you off.
Oh, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Arrests at the schools were decreased by 67%, along with the 73% decrease in the number of weapons on campus. So, and the graduation rate increased too. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask you about this Judge Teskey, Stephen Teskey.
Yeah, he actually he's had to, he's testified before Congress on this issue. He absolutely is an expert. And it's not the only school system that's gone from trying the tough on crime approach to seeing that, okay, this really doesn't work. This is actually counterproductive. And again, I also don't want to misconstrue it either, that some people can say that, well, I just want any kind of behavior, like a kid, violently assault somebody. There is a place for, really serious stuff. Yes, that should involve the criminal justice system. Then yes, that is appropriate. But in many ways, what we're doing is manufacturing this stuff, and it doesn't need to be that way. I get, like I said in the article, they should check it out. There really are some really severe examples that I went through. But yeah, the point is in general, once you get into that system, it's tough to get out of it. It tends to create more criminals. It tends to not rehabilitate people. Some people, that is the sort of scared straight that they need. But for most people, it's counterproductive.
Yeah, and some of this stuff just really shocks the conscience too. You already mentioned the Meridian, Mississippi case, but I was really shocked when I read that. It's just so sad.
Yeah, it really is. And again, I don't want some people to think that that's every school and that's every city, but I kind of want people to understand. Let's think about it this way. 30% of schools now have a school resource officer. What if this trend starts to continue? What if when a kid mouths off and gets out of line in school, that we just automatically start referring them to the criminal justice system? I don't want that to be the standard. I'm genuinely scared for that to happen.
And it's an issue that I feel doesn't get a lot of play either. You mentioned those videos that make the rounds on social media, and I think it's not enough, but at the same time, that gives me a little bit of hope that Just with policing in general, now people have cell phones, so you have to think that things like this were happening before, but people just didn't know about it because they didn't record it, or it happened and no one said anything about it.
Yeah. Well, again, we didn't really have a lot of police officers on campus before. This is a fairly new trend over the last couple of decades. Um, Again, most of these types of things were handled within the school. When something really serious went down, obviously they're going to call the police. But like I said, when you have that officer right there on campus, a lot of times it does tend to be counterproductive. It's, you're going to make arrests in many cases for stuff that just doesn't deserve an arrest. A fifth grader who kicks a trash can should not be arrested.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I meant in terms of recording things in the general public, not in schools.
Yeah, I agree with you.
That's something I always kind of ponder about. Were things this bad always with police officers or police brutality, or did we just not see it?
I would definitely say so, particularly again when we talk about the racial aspect. I mean, that's when the Rodney King thing happened, that's what a lot of Black people will tell you. Guess what? You're just starting to see it now. Now you have the evidence. We've been telling you about this stuff for many years.
Right.
And you go back to the Jim Crow days and all that, where a Black man could be lynched for looking at somebody wrong. Now, again, that was a long time ago, but there's an element to that currently.
And there's things that I really rage about too, especially when it comes to the use of non-lethal compliance weapons, which tend to be lethal sometimes, or even in my
tasers.
Yes, and even
people do die from tasers sometimes.
Right, and I think the UN Commission deemed tasers to be a form of torture. John W. Whitehead does a bunch of work on that as well at the Rutherford Institute. And even in my experience as a public defender, I've seen people in jail that have been mauled by police dogs, and they're sitting in the holding cell and they have no medical attention.
No, the actual, if I remember right, it was in San Francisco. The police union in San Francisco, they were lobbying for this. That they haven't been successful, but they're trying to allow for the use of tasers in non-violent, a situation where the threat of violence isn't on the table. It hasn't gone through, but the fact that they're even considering that, I mean, it's just unconscionable.
Well, and they're doing it de facto too, because I've seen a lot of, there's cases all over the place of 87-year-old grandmother tased in her bed, or 8-year-old child tased on school bus, or 13-year-old child tased on school bus. Girl.
And my biggest grief with this is, again, it comes down to that human component. I get it. There's going to be bad cops, there's bad teachers, there's bad everything. But the system has a way, especially with the criminal justice system, it really doesn't punish the wrongdoers within it, the people who are within the system. It's really rare that they're held accountable.
Right. And another theme that you kind of got on, and we're running out of time a little bit here. There was so much that you had brought to the table that I wanted to touch on. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Another thing I wanted to touch on just was sentence disparities. That's something you kind of got into in your first episode of your show. But that's just an example of it. It goes hand in hand with people not being punished.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. No, I mean, and it's one of the things I've pointed out, because I talk about a lot of like white collar crime. Again, my sort of theme of Rackets, and you'll see it all the time. A person who is politically connected, or a corporation, a multi-billion-dollar corporation can get away with all kinds of crimes as long as they have funded the right politicians and the right regulators. They'll get away with paying a fine that's really merely the cost of doing business. It's just a whole different procedure for white collar crime. You even, a white collar, if you're, say, an executive at a corporation, you get and of course I'm forgetting the term now, but you get a letter basically notifying you that you're being investigated. You as an individual, you would never get a notice from the DOJ. By the way, I want you to know that we're investigating you for possible criminal activity.
Right.
I mean, there's just this whole different system. for the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah. Well, it's been a real pleasure, Brian. And as we're closing up here, I definitely want to have you back on the show, but I know I'm going to include your websites and all of your articles in the show notes page, but is there anywhere else where can people find your podcast at?
It's really on most every platform. I have it hosted on Anchor, but it's on all the major ones, Google Play and iTunes and all that.
Are you still with me there, Brian?
Crony capitalism again, corrupt politicians, white collar criminals. There's all types of aspects to this stuff, and I try to give people.
Oh, hang on there, Brian. I lost connection with you for a good 20 seconds here, and now you've cut out again.
Can you hear me?
I can now. Can you hear me, Brian? You still with me, Brian? All right. Well, it seems that we've lost connection with Brian here, but just for the recording's sake, I'm just going to let everyone know that you can find Brian's work at briansaady.com. That is Brian, BrianSaady.com. And there's links to all of his books, his podcast. There's also a portfolio page where you can see all of his work. And I'll try and get in touch with Brian here to close out the episode, but definitely thank Brian for coming on. I really appreciate it. I was really excited to get him on and talk about his work. So be sure to check out his podcast and briansaady.com. But thanks so much, Brian, for joining me.